Make that big boss less special. It ain't no game, but they saying welcome to the second level. Second level.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming on out. This next panel that we're going to have is titled Our Princesses in Another Castle, Feminism, Women in the Game Industry. This panel is going to be moderated by Fox Smith, and introducing the panel, Carol Mertz, Lisa Brunette, EMiSpicer, and Francesca Carletto Leon. Take it away, Fox.
Awesome, thank you so much. Well, first off, thank you everyone for being here. My name is Fox Smith, and I'm going to be the friendly moderator of today's panel. So welcome to Our Princesses in Another Castle, Feminism in Video Games, brought to you by Superheroines, etc. And for anyone who does not know, Superheroines, etc. is a 501c3 nonprofit based here in St. Louis, but we do have a chapter in Cincinnati, and our mission is to empower women and those who identify as women to embrace their inner nerd. So we do this by providing safer spaces for women to explore their nerdy interests, share their geeky passions, and build community that fully represents and welcomes women in marginalized communities. So you can find out more by visiting us online at superheroinesetc.org, or feel free to come up and speak to me afterward. I would love to talk to anybody. Just a little bit about me. My name again is Fox Smith. I am the president of the board for Superheroines, etc. And aside from that, I am an illustrator, performer, storyteller, and one of my big nerdy passions is gaming, so I am super excited to be here. And I would like to go ahead and allow the panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. You've probably seen me running around. My name is Carol Mertz. I am the executive director of Pixelpop Festival. I'm also an independent game designer, and I'm currently, I live in New York. Right now I'm studying for my master's in fine arts of game design from the NYU Game Center in New York City. So I have published a handful of games, both console and tabletop and mobile, and lots of small web games dating back as far as like 2010, 2011. So I've been doing this for a little bit. That's me. Hi.
Hi, I'm EMiSpicer. I am technically based out of New York, but I'm only there for about 2 weeks of every month because I travel around the world taking photos at as many games and games-adjacent events that I possibly can. That's how I got my start in games about 8 years ago. From there, I started getting involved with the events themselves, so I've become somewhat of an events organizer as well, and I do social media for games companies also. So basically, in short, I do pretty much everything you can in games, but actually make games. I'm a workaholic, and that's who I am.
Hi, I'm Lisa Brunette. I have credits in millions of games all over the world. I've been a game designer and writer for more than a decade in the industry, and prior to that, I was a journalist, writer, and teacher.
Hi, everybody. I'm Francesca. I'm an independent designer and developer. I'm actually here showing one of my games, or two of my games, actually. One is tabletop and one is digital. Please come say hi later. So I did my undergraduate in game development, and now I'm also getting an MFA along with Carol at the NYU Game Center. So my work is primarily digital, but I've recently been expanding out into tabletop games as well as alternative controller projects. I also work with Girls Make Games, which is an organization that runs summer camps and workshops for around middle school age girls, teaching them about coding and game development.
Awesome, thank you so much. And so first thing, everyone, please give a warm welcome to the panelists. We could not be doing this without you guys. And I also wanted to say really quickly before we get started that while all of us are here to share our thoughts and experiences with feminism, representation, and inclusivity in the gaming world, we do not represent every single voice, identity, things like that, but we're here to share with you what our experiences have been and hopefully open the dialogue to get you guys talking as well and just keep everything going. So, jumping off, I would like to go ahead and ask the panelists the first question. What has your experience been like in the gaming world, both as players and creative? And some good things, some bad things, whatever the spirit moves you to say. And I guess if you want to just start down the row, we can go that way.
Sure. So as a creator, I've really enjoyed my time. I think the part of why I do Pixelpop Festival is because I love the indie games community so much, and I feel so supported by it. I wanted to give back and help provide those resources to the people who've been so welcoming to me. I don't subscribe to Xbox Live because the first time that I ever got on Xbox Live, a preteen threatened me with some really horrible things that I will not repeat on this panel. So that was like my very first experience in online games, and that really put me off to it because it was a very gendered situation. I was horrified by it, and I was terrified of online games from then on. And even still, I play Destiny with friends a lot, and anytime I go into like a multiplayer situation, I always send some braver friends than I into the voice chat before me, just be like, is this person cool? Am I gonna feel really uncomfortable if I pop into voice chat? That's kind of affected me for the last probably decade, because that was back when Guitar Hero was still a thing. But otherwise, yeah, like my experience as a creator so far has largely been good.
I don't feel like there's a easy or succinct way of answering that question, just because it's so mixed, right? Yeah. Like, I'm in my 30s, and so I'm of the generation that grew up with games. Games were just a normalized part of childhood for people, certainly of my age and younger, and maybe a little bit older too. I don't want to project, but games were always an equalizer for me. Like, I'm clearly a nerd and have always been one, but like, games were how I connected with my bullies. Like, I made friends with the people who used to beat me up because we all played Pokemon together. I would hang out with kids from the football team and play Smash in the rec room. Like, it was how a bunch of people who didn't get along could come together and get along. When I stumbled into the games industry in 2010, I started to find out that there were people who didn't want me there just because of what kind of body I had. And clearly, Pixelpop is a wonderful environment that isn't about that. It's about celebrating our differences and coming together and sharing, right? But that doesn't change the fact that I have spent 8 years in an industry that fundamentally tries to undermine my expertise as an individual simply because of like one facet of my identity. And I love it here. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I wouldn't have spent 8 years of my life here, but also I'm so tired. And I don't feel like this conversation can be had without talking about that dual existence fighting with each other just the entire time.
Yeah, I would echo that for sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I think when I introduced myself, I messed up and I said something like I have credits in millions of games, which would be pretty damn impressive. I know. I actually have credits in hundreds of games, played worldwide by millions of players.
Also amazing.
And
also amazing, yes.
And I decided last minute, which is why I flubbed it, especially with the lights on me, to throw that in because I have, for the last decade, more than a decade, been making games for families and women over 40. Mm-hmm. And if you hadn't heard that stat before, you'd probably think that was like a small, marginal, maybe things are changing. But I have spent most of that decade explaining to people, yes, women play games, yes, there are a lot of them. I actually worked at a company that did that and had more than 600 employees and offices all over the world and worked with a team, network of developers all over the world. So women are here, and it is exhausting, actually, to constantly have to justify that. I'm kind of feeling emotional in that I have 4 female students from my Webster University classes this past year in the audience. And one guy, too. Didn't need to leave him out. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I want them to know, that they deserve a place here. One of the reasons I decided to teach was because at a conference, some student came up to me. I was just a visiting lecturer person for a week. And this woman said, "Oh my God, I had no idea that the games I play on my phone are actually games." And that's a job, because I went to work for this game studio with these dudes and they hated me and said what I do is not a game and just made it really impossible and wouldn't hire me. So that sucked.
Yeah. I was scooting forward, getting all oh man,
I could feel it.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate that you're mentioning your students. So I think I am the youngest here, I think. So I have kind of a unique experience where, as I said, I did an undergraduate in games. I went to school for games, wanting to get into this industry. And coming from a place where I didn't know a lot about game development or the industry or anything, even just going into that university program, I immediately felt alienated. I did not self-identify as a feminist until I got to undergrad, actually, and then it became a necessary part of my identity because it was something that felt so threatened. I don't know. So it was difficult. I was one of maybe 3 female students in my year in my game development program, and then one of them dropped out, and there were even fewer of us. So that was definitely something that was a struggle for me, and I got to a lot of points even in that very short university career where I had to sit down with myself and really consider, is this something I do want to pursue, where I'm going to be struggling? This is only a smaller instance of a lot of the communities that I might face going forward, and is this something that I can commit myself to and face this maybe every day for the rest of my career? I decided yes, which I'm really glad I did. Going to even my first GDC compared to my most recent GDC, I definitely think the industry is evolving and changing as games tools become so much more accessible and the communities become a lot more accessible and welcoming. And it's been very, very great to see those communities changing and become a lot more welcoming. And I think it's really important that we're all out there advocating for those spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, just for myself, I have not really been involved with the game creations aspect of things. And as a gamer, I've been fortunate and privileged enough that most of my gaming experience have been generally positive. I was an only child raised by my father, and so I don't think really treated me genderedly, if that's because I remember when I was a kid, he gave me all the Nintendo systems as they came out, and that was kind of what my childhood was like. And it wasn't until I got older that I had realized that, oh no, there's some ugly little pockets of this, and I think Carol, you and I had met before this to discuss a few things, and the idea that being the first people going into any sort of field, especially as a woman going into a male-dominated field, it's not easy, and it's something that you have to be really, I'll go ahead and say brave to be able to do, and have a lot of, just a lot of fortitude, to be able to do that. So I think that's really wonderful, and I think we're already starting to see what some of the changes have been because there are women willing to go into these places and other marginalized people willing to go into these places and make space at the table for everybody. And so that being said, I think all of us have probably seen many instances, especially in media, online and things, of women who will come forward and say that they've received certain types of treatment, or we'll even see where they are receiving threats and all sorts of terrible, terrible things, being said by people online. So my next question is, why do you think that people have such a hard time believing women's stories from within the gaming industry and world, especially when we see so much evidence of it happening?
I mean, just from my perspective, I feel like a lot of people just want to believe it's not happening. I think a lot of people want to believe that their friend isn't the one that could have done that. I think a lot of people want to think that these things that are being said aren't as bad as you think they are, or that you're misunderstanding them, or all of these things are always these excuses that we get when we try to like bring up, no, that made me feel really uncomfortable. No, like even being at work, or like seeing microaggressions thrown at you, seeing like, so I worked for 6 years as a studio owner, and I had it was me and another female business partner and a male business partner. And like 80 to 90% of the time, people would email only our male business partner. And it's like, we notice that sort of thing. That sort of thing hurts, but we try to bring that up, and it's like, oh, maybe they just didn't realize that you had the same kind of email address, or maybe they weren't thinking about you. And it's like, it's fine once, it's fine twice, it's fine 3 times. I think we were talking about this, but like, the more it happens, the more it just starts, like, you realize, like, this isn't me making it up. I don't know that answers your question about like whether or not, like, why is it so hard for people to believe. I think it's just that people don't necessarily think about the fact that like we've been facing this, and we're trying, like, we're screaming so loud, we're trying so hard to just get you to understand that this isn't a misunderstanding. You know, this is something that we're actually dealing with, and even if it seems small, those small things really add up. And tend to really push people out.
Well, and I think too that there's an element of that as a business owner, as a studio owner, kind of just almost, well, not almost, passively aggressively says, oh, you're not actually the legitimate owner of this endeavor. You know, and you know what I mean? I feel like there's some element of when someone's refusing to, you know, give you that respect, it is also excluding you from that conversation. And I think what we had talked about before is just in terms of representation, which is something we will also get to on this lovely panel. You know, as an Asian woman, I saw somebody describe it before, you know, when the first person ever asked me where I was from, it didn't really bother me, right? And I had somebody describe it as like a dripping faucet. You know, the first time, it doesn't bother you. The second time, it doesn't bother you. But after hundreds upon hundreds of time, and that's what's happening to you all the time.
That's how the was formed.
Right.
Appreciate that metaphor so much.
And I think part of it is that the way these narratives are presented to us, like, because it isn't presented as like something with nuance and something with subtlety. A lot of the narratives that are presented to us are, you know, some like a sexist is somebody who beats their girlfriend. You know what I mean? And I would never do that. I love women. I love my mom. I love my sister. And like, we hear these things over and over again. We all know these examples, but what we aren't necessarily taught in a universal way is the subtle things. Like, similar to Carol, like I was once at a industry event with a friend who is a man who was my junior in the industry, and someone approached the both of us and didn't even acknowledge me as a part of the conversation, and only spoke to him despite the fact that I had more experience and time in the field. And while that doesn't necessarily make somebody's perspective less important, time in a space, like, you know, seniority, like, let's get rid of that because young, fresh voices are so important and are the ones who are often at the forefront of changing things. That doesn't change the fact that I had a lot of relevant information to say, but this person wouldn't even give me a chance to come to the plate because they just chose to discredit me. And it wasn't an active thing. They weren't actively like, oh, this person doesn't have anything to say because, you know, I have the specific question that the specific other person could answer. They didn't even ask me, do you have any thoughts on this? I didn't even get to try and be like, oh no, I've never had experience with your specific problem, or say, yes, actually I have a wealth of knowledge, which was the case, but the person didn't give me the opportunity. And it's all those subtleties, right? It's the subtleness of, and some of it is undeniably social awkwardness. Like, let's take, for example, the fact that it took me and Carol years to speak to each other because we both were scared that we would annoy each other, right? That's absolutely a factor, being bold enough to say, hi, I want to talk to you, like, you're here.
I secretly think you're really cool.
Right? And that's like, you want to hope that that's what it is. You want to hope that somebody is just a shy weirdo like you are, and so they don't know how to include you in the conversation. And that's something that you learn and get better at, but I still personally struggle with. But there's a difference, you know what I mean? And when you notice that somebody is doing it to the same kinds of people over and over and over again, you're like, oh, this isn't about me as an individual. Yeah. This isn't about us messing up a social interaction because we're a bunch of goofballs who are bad at this. This is about something that is systemic and hurting lots of different people who are unique but have one superficial commonality. And it's really tiring and it's sad, you know, like, to make this intersectional, like, this is that much more for different kinds of women, and this is that much more for queers and people of color. Like, it all gets compounded exponentially, like, based on your environment and what you have going for you. Like, as hard as it is for us, like, it becomes that much harder for other women in our community. It's just, it sucks.
That's going to be the catchphrase for today. It sucks. So something happened yesterday that fits in really well with this. I had a business that I dissolved in Washington State so I could open a new one in Missouri, and the Washington State business had a minority partner, 30% was a male. So I went to close the credit card, and Bank of America would not let me close the credit card. I'm the 70%. Because they had listed the male as the primary. And this is about the 25th time something like this has happened to me from corporations, by the way. And, you know, you can get angry, but it's like this not even malicious, stupid corporate nonsense. But, you know, Bank of America was losing my business anyway, and that just sealed the deal. And that's kind of where I go with it is in my business, because I've always made games for women, it's like you lose money, you lose opportunity if you ignore this audience or you attempt to pander to it or serve it in the wrong way. So for me, I kind of bring it back to like our corporate or our capitalistic ideals in some ways, because in the game industry, unfortunately, a lot of times that's what talks is, you know, we want the game to perform. I mean, in a more holistic, wholehearted way, we always knew we loved the games, and we knew if they didn't sell, we would all go home. So there's that. But I think you hit on it. I can't remember. I think it was both Fox and Carol talking earlier about, you know, it's people you know. It's people you know that who don't think they're sexist, and they're your friend, and then they say something to you at work like you're acting just like the men in your workplace, but suddenly you're the bitch, or you're this or you're that. Like there's this expectation that women should behave differently, which is really unfair, because in order to work in that world, you have to be more aggressive and more like them, I suppose, if we want to gender it that way, but it doesn't have to be that way. But those are the ones that I think are the hardest to deal with, is when it's a mixed bag situation, like either an employer that is in some ways great for women and in other ways has this crappy culture that promotes like certain behavior that makes it a hostile place for women, or a coworker who will say something to you like that when you're boss is actually telling you to be more aggressive. So it's exhausting again. It's like really, it just makes it hard. It's a stressful place anyway, games, because there's just deadlines and expectations and performance you have to worry about and playtesting feedback and all these things. And then to have this other layer that, you know, some people don't have.
Yeah, and I wanted to just build off of that. I think the biggest thing is just like not assuming things about people because of the way that they're presenting. And a lot of the time, I think like I have even done this in the past. Like these are very, very small things that we might be doing subconsciously. Like a lot of these microaggressions that we're talking about, people might not even realize that they're doing that until someone mentions it to them. And I also think that us as individuals, we can learn how to, when people do mention these microaggressions, how we can take them, like take that feedback and improve our behavior or reflect upon it. Like I've had so many people ask me, like, or if you go to GDC, it's like if you see a woman at a booth, people will assume they're the girlfriend, or they'll assume they're the artist writer, because there's no way they're involved in like tech stuff.
Or marketing.
Or marketing, or producer, or things like that. And that's something that people are assuming, and it's something that when you hear it, that tripping like thousands and thousands of times, you're like, oh, that's the role that I should be doing or something. So like when I was like in undergrad, I was told, not like told, but like very subtly hinted at, like very subconsciously, that like, oh, like women are good at art stuff, so that's maybe something you should be doing, like graphic design. And I think it's just like these little things, when you're told it over and over again that like you don't belong in these spaces, or you should be participating in a certain way, it does start sinking in, and you start thinking in that way, and you start assuming that of others. It's just like this cycle. And like I've done that accidentally, where I've asked a woman, oh, did you do the art? And they say, no, I'm a programmer, and I want to kill myself, because it's just like, it's like so subconscious, and I'm just reiterating this thing that I've been told 1,000 times. And it does take a lot of self-reflection and being very conscious of the assumptions we're having about the people around us to correct that.
And in the industry, it's almost become something of a joke, right? Like when we talk to other women who've run booths and things like this, or gone to large shows, especially like really big shows like GDC, the joke is always like, okay, how many times did you get asked today if you were somebody's girlfriend?
Yeah.
And it sounds tropey. It sounds like it's an old hat. But the reason we still talk about it is because it still happens all the time. And so why we talk about it is because we want you to realize your own internal biases, and realize that these are things that we are all doing. These are mistakes that we're all making, because this is something that society has ingrained in us to think and assume about other women in the industry.
And we're still having this panel, for example, right? Like almost every event that you'll go to, if there is any kind of speaking track whatsoever, you will end up at this panel.
This is my third.
And it's really exhausting, right? And I think I've been privately talking about this for the past month because of my work as a photographer and my attempts to document the historic nature of the games community. What is erased, right? And this is something that has happened throughout all kinds of culture for hundreds of years, right? What women and people who aren't white men are done is systematically erased because of who has access to this historical documentation. So even though this panel has been happening for who even knows how long.
This is literally the 4th time Pixelpop Festival has hosted a Women in Games panel.
Right? And so it's happening again and again and again and again, but there is nobody really putting together the narrative of the women and the other people who this industry is built on. Like, we recognize a lot of really powerful men for their contributions, but there was a really great series of talks at Indiecade, I want to say 2015, that was led by Rachel Weil, who does a lot of work in preserving and documenting femininity in games, and she led a series of talks that were from senior women in the games community who are, for all intents and purposes, erased. And it happens over and over again. Like, we know all the men from Nintendo, right? Like, everyone can think of the men from Nintendo, like, off the top of their heads, but not a lot of people can think of the women who were pioneering the education games in the 90s.
Yeah.
And they are so important in informing our modern game culture and community, and yet we don't really see them. And I hate it. I hate it. And I think a lot of the reason why this panel has to keep happening over and over again is because of systemic erasure, because of how we define history and who is historic in any community. But, you know, because we're in games.
Right. So on that line of women who are the front runners and the way pavers, there is also an element of your own, I guess I'll go ahead and say career safety that becomes at stake in a lot of these scenarios, right? And so my next question is, because I think it's important to call out bad behavior, right? It's important to call out when these things are happening, but how do you call out this bad behavior in a male-dominated environment where there's also potentially a lot at stake for you personally, right? How does one make a difference while still protecting yourself and create these safe, teachable moments to where you can call these things out and you can make statements about this, but you can still feed yourself and you can still pursue the thing that you're passionate about?
Maybe just to open it up, not talking specifically about like working within the industry, but I wanted to follow up a little bit on Carol mentioning like online gaming. A strategy that I have developed as someone who plays a lot of competitive online games that I really enjoy, and I love being competitive, so part of that is like using voice chat and coordinating with a team. Like, I find that so rewarding and enjoyable, but there is always that risk that, like, let's say you're playing a game of Dota 2, you're gonna get trapped in there with a jerk who wants to undermine you for 45 minutes is like average game time, right? And something that's been really important for me is like finding someone who will play with me, who will back me up when I speak up, and making sure that you are surrounding yourself with people who, when you say, hey, that's not cool, they will back you up and they will say, yeah, that wasn't okay. And I think that's so important, because it becomes so much harder to mention these even just like microaggressions to people when you are alone or when you feel you're alone, right? So I feel like even in a space like Pixelpop, we know that, you know, we are all not alone. This is very much like a community, and even just that support makes it so much easier to address these issues.
I feel like I'm a bad example of maintaining safety, because a lot of my career is punctuated by publicly outing people for their abuse, and then as a result becoming unsafe in a lot of spaces. Google me. But one of the ways that I like try not to focus on that is in my work as an events organizer. It's not passive aggressive, it's full on aggressive. I aggressively curate my events in such a way that shows that white boy festivals are unnecessary.
Thank you.
It's like, every year I say, it is this year, and how is this still happening this way? And of course there are a lot of reasons why it does still happen. When you're trying to fill your lineup with people who are not white men, like, they're all exhausted too, they're all tired, they're used to being tokenized as well, which makes it even harder. And so when you're constantly fighting for a balanced space in a space that is inherently exhausting and scary, like, it's hard, and not everybody wants to come to bat anymore. Yeah. Like, I'm personally like very tired and significantly scaling back on the things that I used to, because I just can't do it anymore. But I try to, with every event that I become a part of, bring that to the experience. I try to make sure, like, if there are too many white men, I say there are too many white men and we need to stop. Or I say, we don't have enough gay people, can we please get some more gay people here? And, like, this is too white. Like, we can't have so many white people, this is atrocious. And, like, those are the things that you have to do. You have to constantly be checking yourself. You have to constantly be learning. And I say that, you know, I grew up in New York. Like, I grew up with a New York education. And the New York education says, Martin Luther King happened, and now no one's racist anymore. Racism solved. But that's not true. We all know that's not true. Look at the America that we live in. It's clearly not true. So we all have to work hard all the time. We can't just accept that some stuff happened in our past and it's all solved. We all have to be constantly trying to be doing more and better, even when it seems scary and uncomfortable. There are words that I'm constantly eliminating from my vocabulary because I have to always be growing and changing. Otherwise, I will be a boring grandpa, and I don't want to be the embarrassing grandpa. I want to, like, if I'm going to be the embarrassing grandpa, I want to be the embarrassing grandpa who says, I am sorry, I will try to do better for you. You know, like, we all make mistakes and we all have to do better, but, like, I think that's why I've internalized intersectional feminism as intensely as I have, because I have seen the repercussions of thinking that somebody has done enough and then they can just stop learning. I don't ever want to stop learning, and I think that we all have to be active in continuing to learn, and I think part of that is I literally use the camera to show people that there can be more and better, and just making it the status quo is boring.
Well, and I think there is definitely a necessity for people who are willing to be outright aggressive too. So I definitely want to thank anyone who's willing to do that, because I think it's important, right? Like, you need all spectrums of the conversation happening during all of this. But yeah, I guess, did anyone else have any thoughts on?
I was just going to say that, so to get back to your question, I think the aggressive moves are absolutely necessary, or none of us would be even on this panel at this conference. But I think because it's such a drain, that what I have done, and I'm 46. This is my actual hair color.
It's beautiful.
I'm really
Thank you. And thank you to all you 20-somethings for bringing the trend in. So I've been doing this for a long time, and I've weathered some pretty severe sexual harassment. I mean, not quid pro quo or anything like that, but I've been through some stuff. I was in the fishing industry, the first woman to edit a magazine in its 60-year history, so I've seen things. So at this point in my life, what I try to do is positive things. So I mentor young women. I've taught and tried to spread the message to all students of all genders about what this world is like for non-white men, not to pick on them. I make allies of white men whenever possible. I think I've had kind of a privileged existence because I always have been making games for women, especially older women, and so it's already built in that I am the expert in that audience, but you'd be surprised still at how many men have tried to mansplain that audience to me in the workplace, which is kind of interesting. But yeah,
I really love when men try to mansplain my own job.
Yeah.
To me, that's my absolute favorite, where they're like, well, I'm not part of this organization at all, and here's how it works. I'm like, oh, yes, that you're totally right. Thank you for knowing more than me about the organization that I literally work for.
And then, because for me, it's all about the games. Like, I want to make games. That's where I want all my energy to be. And so the energy of making those games better and making them the kind of games that women want to play, that are open to all genders. I love the accessibility guy this morning talking about games and color blindness, which is something I never thought about. But we dealt with ageism a lot in games and looking at like we have 20-somethings making games for people in their 70s, and so like they can't see what you can see and stuff like that. So I just want to look at how can we make the change without always having to fight. The fight is important, but it is draining.
I mean, I can answer it, but if you want to move on to more topics, I mean,
I think this is good.
So yeah, I mean, so like I generally take a very diplomatic approach when I can, because I am a self-preservationist. I can't get into fist fights. I'm not strong enough, and I try to avoid like just putting myself in uncomfortable positions. And so because of that, I wind up having to make like I realized when I introduced with your first question, I said, oh, the creator community has been really amazing for me. That's because I've been conditioned to say that. In a lot of ways it has, but in a lot of ways I've really struggled, and I've had some really frustrating experiences. And I talk about them with my friends, and I talk about them with people who I trust, and I hope that those stories get told and shared so that I'm not the only person holding on to those. But I'm terrified to say them in public because people don't believe and because people will harass because of the experiences that I've had. And so it's something that I think it's like there's been, somebody's named it something like the whisper network of people just kind of like sharing their stories internally among other people who are marginalized, so that we know like who are the companies that are kind of scary to work with, and who are the people who have undermined us on several occasions, and you know, what are the situations, what are the parties that I went to at GDC where somebody grabbed me, things like that, where like you don't want to be labeled as the victim. You don't want to complain to the person who's running an event that you were really lucky to go to. You should feel really lucky to be in this space. You should feel very important to be among all of these people who are so much more important than you because we've told you that they're more important than you. And to be labeled as the victim because you come forward is a scary thing, and can affect your career. And so those are things that are kind of constantly running through my mind when I'm trying to weigh, should I talk about this situation publicly, or should I just talk about it with my friends?
Well, I think there's being labeled as the victim, but also being labeled as a troublemaker, I think is a really big part of that as well, because there's plenty of instances that I can think of off the top of my head where, well, somebody complained about this, like they complain about these sorts of things even when nothing's going on, so even that idea I feel like can be very detrimental to, in these quote unquote professional spaces that are supposed to kind of be professional spaces, but end up not really from other people. So moving on, I had sent everyone the questions beforehand, but surprise, it's going to be a different question. So, because I really do want to get into this idea of the representation in games themselves. And so for myself as a storyteller and even as an artist and performer, stories are very important to me because they share the perspectives of hopefully many different people, right? And that's how we learn about other people. That's how we learn about the world and how we connect with other people. And when there's only a single type of story being told, then I feel like, and this is a little bit of my own theory, but I feel like other people become afraid of other stories, right? Like things that are too different from them become scary and unknown, right? And so we all have seen in a lot of just the video game world, there are primarily games that feature white men as the character with agency, and it's not completely across the board, and there have been more, especially as more tools are made available and more indie games are coming out, like there is definitely more of a reaching grasp. But my question to all of you is, what would it take, do you think, to really change that? I think there's an element of encouraging marginalized communities to actually start to create more, but it can be tiresome. And so what do you think we can do to help encourage more diverse stories to be told, to have more types of characters, to have more experiences shared? because there's something about gaming that is different than movies, right? You're putting yourself into it. You're actively participating. So I think there's a power to that is different and, quite frankly, more powerful than a lot of other media. So take it away.
Well, I can say one of the questions, because when I worked for a publisher for about 5 years, I was in partnership with a lot of developers, so all over the world, and from Russia to Philippines and a lot of places. And so you interact with a lot of different cultures, many of which are not as politically correct as ours, or evolved as ours is probably the better way to say that. So, for example, in a game I was working on, this is our early build, there was a picture of an old woman in a rocking chair in the game, or a character, and not only did it kind of look like clip art, but it was such a cliche of like, oh, okay, so we're gonna have this older woman, and of course she's gonna be in a shawl, have a shawl around her in a rocking chair, and like, so we actually Googled angry old woman, and there she was. So it was clip art. So that was the first problem. But in defense of that developer, in other countries, they don't have the copyright issues that we have in the United States. There's just a different culture around that in a lot of places. So, but still cliche. So working on those cliches a lot is something that I've done. And one of the questions I throw to them is, who is the fantasy for? So in that same game with the old woman, you know, you'd also get like boobs in your face. And like if our audience is women over 40, they're not really liking either of those characters. They're not seeing them as terribly complex or well developed, at least not in the psychological way. Wow. Yeah.
Always gets me somehow.
So, but I'll give you an example of what they did like. And that was a detective named Dupin who had an Edwardian coat and an ascot, and just created a fan club around him, this character in these games. He was a regular character. That worked for the audience. So I've been pretty lucky to work in an arena where what I like is what the player likes, but I would say other games, hardcore, more that traditional young male audience, you know, that audience itself is aging. It's now more middle-aged, for one thing. And why wouldn't you want more players? So many young women are playing Overwatch and loving the characters there. Why wouldn't you want more sales? So adding more characters in, that the fantasy gets broadened out. It's not just this narrow fantasy that a lot of white young guys don't even like that, really. You know, like I've talked to men, and what they like in women is very different and diverse. So,
well, and it's
very narrow.
It's one of the sorts of things as well that one of my big soapboxes is representations of Asians in media. That's beyond, you know, kung fu people and all of this. And you know, one of the things that I consistently hear is, oh, well, people are going to have a hard time identifying with. You know, and it's like, well, if you never tell our stories, then yes, people will have a hard time identifying with that. But also, funny, I've been identifying with white men my entire life, and I've seemed to have had just a fine time with that. And so we only have a few minutes left, so I want to give everybody else a chance to respond, but just bear that in mind.
Yeah, I don't know. I think this is where I put the curator hat back on, and I think it's reward and showcase work that features people who aren't white straight men, just like you would the work that features white straight men. Like, and that's all there is to it, right? Don't put it in a corner and like label it as the different space. Put it right in the middle and in the center, just like you would the other works, and reward it for existing. Say this is good and legitimate and required the same amount of effort this other thing did. And even though this may not necessarily have like the American capitalist like values and storytelling and production that we've all come to accept as what something that's good looks like it is good, it is valuable, it changes things. And I've gotten really frustrated with the concept of ahead of its time. lately, it's not that things are ahead of their time, it's that they pioneer and they change. And reflecting and allowing those things to have the pedestal that they deserve instead of undermining them for not having been able to succeed in an inhospitable environment is so important.
Yeah.
I'm just going to jump in. I just feel like there are so many stories that need to be told that haven't yet been told. And there are a lot of stories that need to be told that are starting to be told, especially in the indie game space. And that's where we have the flexibility to what we would consider experiment with demographic, which is silly because we're all people who love to play games and we're all people who love to make games, and we deserve to make games that tell our own stories. And as we become more aware of the things that can push people out of the industry, we can actually invite more people into the industry to tell their own stories, to provide better representation of their own backgrounds and their own histories, and to create a more welcoming space for everyone.
That was really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think just also going off of what everyone else has said, which has been fantastic. Thank you for having me on this panel. But I just wanted to say, like, also as consumers and as people who play games, support marginalized developers. Like, give them your money, give them your attention, instead of buying a $60 AAA game with questionable representation. That $60 would mean so much to an indie developer who is trying to make something a little bit different and tell a unique story. And I think that's super important to do. Someone on Twitter was recently talking about, like, why are all games with queer content visual novels? And it's because those games are more accessible for developers who don't have a lot of funding and a lot of resources. So give those people your resources and your support, and then we can tell more stories and get more perspectives into games.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. That's a really big part of keeping the dialogue going as well and making change. So give yourselves a round of applause, and please let's thank our panelists again for being here. Again, I am Fox. I am here with Superheroes, etc. Feel free to chat us up afterward, and thank you.
Bye.
It ain't no game, but they saying welcome to the second level.